Well, my talk is about Entity API, and I didn't realize that I would be after the party. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done it in Prezi, because Prezi might make you a little bit queasy. First of all, I didn't build the Entity API, and I would like to give the credits to the person who did build the Entity API, who is Vago, who really made all this possible to work with the Entity API. And all those people that have built modules with like Commerce, Profile, building the Entity API, if you look at those modules, then you learn a great deal about the Entity API. Thumbs up for Vago. You can, if you want, you can, it probably won't work on a tablet, but there's a link you can type in to follow the presentation. Since it's Flash, it won't work on tablet, but maybe you have a laptop. You can follow, I'm Teun van Veggel, by the way. I'm Dutch. And you can follow me at NodeAPI. So what I would like to do first is show you why I actually want to talk about the Entity API. I started using it for a module we developed for e-learning for an online English course company. After that, I will go into details about what an entity actually is in Drupal 7. When to use the entity instead of, for example, overriding a node property. How do you actually build your own entity or your own entity type? And I hope to have more or less half of the time to show you the module that we're trying to build, that we're building right now. It's not yet finished. It's a sandbox, so you can download it. But the stuff we came across while building this module, e-learning module, I think it's useful for everyone to see how we have done it, how we have implemented the Entity API. So first, why? Well, the e-learning module that we are developing basically allows users, students, people who pay some money to get access to a course, to do a series of exercises. Exercises have questions, different types of questions, and all the exercises in the chapters or units are always tracked, so you have exercise results. The access to the different courses is controlled, and everything that we try to do is built in entities. So it's not really important to get a global idea about how this really works, because it's not really, the talk is not really about this module, but I'll try to explain in just 1 minute anyway how the e-learning module will work. First you have a course, and the course is, the access to the course is controlled by a course access entity. Then there's an entity reference to a unit. That means that we can attach multiple units. You could call them chapters, capítulos in a book. And you can attach multiple units to a course. You can also reuse units to attach them to different courses. Results of the unit are saved in a unit results entity, which is also custom entity type. The units consist of exercises, different types of exercises. For example, testing exercises for a level test, for example, pruebas de nivel, where you have a limited time, and you have to answer all the questions in that limited time. Another format would be, for example, that you have a time frame for a question, but you have unlimited time for the exercise. Well, the exercise is also saved in an exercise result. So you have different exercise types, and the result is saved in an entity. And finally, the question, the exercise has questions, and it could be any type of question. Open questions, multiple choice questions, drag and drop questions, listening questions, video questions, any type of questions you can imagine. And also, the results are saved per question, so the user can actually go back to the question that he did wrong or right, and he can check, this was my answer, but the correct answer would be, we'll get to that too. So that's the background of my talk, and why did we use Entity API to build this module. So what is an entity? Now, I hope it gets a little bit easier to understand, because this is all familiar stuff. Basically, a lot of things in Drupal 7 are entities. In Drupal 8, everything is an entity. In Drupal 7, a node, a user, taxonomy terms are entities. When you start building your own entity, then just think that anything could be an entity. Anything. Few basic rules about entities. Every entity type, so a node or taxonomy term, has its own table in the database. And every entity belongs to an entity type and to a bundle. We'll see later on what that means. And fields, at least in Drupal 7, are defined per bundle. So in another overview, an entity type has properties. Two are important. The identifier, so the number, like a node ID, and the bundle. And then you can have a whole bunch of other properties which will depend on your entity type. For example, let's look at a few basic examples in Drupal 7. A node has an NID. The bundle, in a case of a node, is called a content type, or a node type, or if you go to the table, it's called type. That's when I always get a little bit like, just pick a name. And after that, it has a whole bunch of other properties like title, whether or not it's promoted to the front page, whether or not it's sticky, whether or not it has comments or not. And all these properties are actually saved as columns in the database. Now, for a lot of you guys, this will be but to know this, for me it was like, when you first start looking into these things, then you think, yeah, it's true, but nobody tells you, and it's such a simple thing. In fact, you could have properties that are not saved in the database, but... So here you see that for every property, there's a column in the database. Same goes for the taxonomy term. You have a unique identifier, which is a TID. You have a vocabulary, which in itself is also an entity. So the bundle could be an entity. And you have a bunch of other descriptions. So the vocabulary is also an entity. And the columns for the database correspond with the properties of the entity. Same goes for the user, with one difference, that the user doesn't have different user types. So the bundle is actually the same as the entity type. So in our e-learning module, these are the entities that we created: the course, the units, the exercises, and the question. And apart from that, also non-fieldable, the entities that you can't attach fields to, such as course access, result for the course, results for the units, results for the exercises, question results, and there might be more as we go along developing the module. So when do you actually use the Entity API? First of all, in Drupal 7, for those who came from Drupal 6 was everything was Node. Drupal 7 was all about entities, but we didn't realize, because the first books that were written about Drupal 7 didn't even mention entity. So when we first started to work with entity as soon as Commerce came out, or Profile, these modules that work with Entity API, to learn about it and to see how they had done it. So first, why would you use entity and not, for example, overriding a node? Well, if you can do it with a node and it's less code, do it with a node. But ask yourself, do I need a page, like node/argument node? Do I need any comments? Do I need to be promoted? And if I don't need all that, do I want my module to be as clean as possible without all this overhead that a node brings? But for us, the most important thing was to build our own entity, was the access to the entity. Because when you try to control the access to a node, then you have to share your access controls with all the other node types. And there's limited functions and can get very complicated when you have to work with, for example, access lists, which is way too complicated for me. So one thing to make clear, in Drupal 7 you have core entity, which was like a halfway implemented version of entity. And the extension entity API, the extra module, contribute module entity API, which extended the core functionality, and all of this will be in core Drupal 8. So why would you install the entity API contributed module if you work with Drupal 7? Well, basically, there's no reason why not. If you do install entity API, you get free CRUD control, so create, delete, update, and read. You get a wrapper, which makes it much easier to get values of fields. We'll see that later. You get rules for free. You get views integration for free. You get features for free. You get internationalization for free. You get automatic field administration, the pages where you can drag and drop your fields for the display and for the managing of the fields. It's all included in this module, and you don't need a single line of code. As long as you install this module, well, maybe 2 lines of code. And a bunch of functions to easily create, delete, save an entity. This will all be in Core 8. Another reason why to use this, because if you're working with 7 and you want to port it to 8 later on, if you use Entity API, then you're covered already. It will hardly be any work. So, the difficult part, well, it's not that difficult really. How to create an entity, a custom entity type. Create your table. And in Drupal, how to create a table is with the hook schema function in your .install module. And you just read the instructions. I'm not going to go through all the options, but you just read the instructions in this function. But basically, you return an array with the key is the name of your entity type, and all the fields are the different columns in your database. Well, I'll skip through that. The second big function is the hook entity info. If you install the entity API, it will use this function, this hook, but it adds a few more options to it. And in this hook entity info hook, you can define the classes that you're going to work with. Defaults are, for the entity itself, it's just entity, and for the controller, so to control create, saving, updating entities, it's entity API controller. You define the base table, the table that we just created, and many more things, which I think is easier just to read on the Drupal website or the contributed module, the entity API module, about this hook, where you see all the options. The Entity API Controller is a class which has a bunch of methods that you can implement. You can build your own class by extending the Entity API Controller and changing, for example, the way your entity is created or saved or loaded. For example, in this example, I have my own custom controller. In the hook entity info file and in the hook entity info function, I say that my controller class is my custom controller, which extends the entity API controller. For example, in the Elearning module, we've used this to attach, when the entities are loaded for the first time, for example, when the exercise is loaded, to already attach the courses and the units that belong to the exercise. Well, I hope I can show you all this in a real example. Then you need to add some of the administration stuff. If you want to create your entity through a form, like for example, the node form, when you create a node, then you do that through form. You need to do that too for your own entity. You need to create a form which holds all the properties of the entity. But that's really very easy. First of all, you create your own. If you update, then you don't have to create your entity, you just get it. But if you create a new entity with a form, then you first need to create an empty entity with entity create. And you can first, it's a very easy function, entity create, which is your type, and then the array with properties that you want to predefine. And one of the properties might be the bundle, or in some cases called the type. And the hook menu is obviously what we use in Drupal 7 to create pages. I forgot that step. But you use the hook menu to create administration pages for the forms, but also for administering all the exercises. And I prefer using views to create just an administrative page, which is also the way that they will do it in Drupal 8. Everything will be views. If you want to know more about that, you can just ask me in the second part of the talk. Then when it comes to the form array just has the properties of your database table. Some of them might be automatic, some of them are, for example, timestamp, but if you want to add them through the form, it's as simple as creating arrays with keys that correspond with the table, the columns of the table with the properties of your entity type. If you have any fields to attach to your entity, then there's a simple function, field attach form. You put it at the end of your form. You can look up the arguments, which one, how it exactly works. But this function, field attach form, is basically the function you use to add fields to the entity. And then you return the form. That's it. It's very, very straightforward. Then the submitting the form, the callback, you need to convert that form that you just built into the entity object. And for that, there's the function entity form submit build entity, which converts your form and your values, the submit values, into the entity, and then it's just a matter of saving the entity. So there's being bothered by a fly here. So very important step is to complete the metadata. Your property, until you change this, is nothing more than a value. Drupal doesn't know what it actually is. For example, if you have a property UID, user, el autor, the author of your entity, then once you build the entity, Drupal doesn't know that it's a user. It only knows that it's an integer, a number in the database table. It doesn't know that you are actually referring to a user. So if you do, let's go back, hook entity property info alter, and you put a DPM for debugging, you want to know what kind of values are in the information file and the information array. You see that where it says here user UID, it thinks the type is an integer. It thinks the label is UID, and it gives it automatically a description, exercise, UID property. So we know, because we built an entity, that it's in fact the user and the author. So a way to change that is to use this hook, change, overwrite that array with your values, and you can use, where it says type, you can just say user. If you built your own entity, and your entity is called Fulanito, then you type in there Fulanito, and it will be automatically connected. Now, this is a great advantage because it will leverage views. You will have all the relations there. You don't have to create handlers to activate the relation between your entity and, for example, the Fulanito entity. If you just give the type Fulanito, you'll see later on that if you create a relationship in views, it will be ready. Yeah, this is just a little example of how I did it. I used array replace recursive. I don't know how you would pronounce that in Spanish, but I'm not going to try. Array. But that's the most difficult part for me to pronounce it properly in Spanish, but I'll try to do that in the second part or in the questions. So what you do with this function, the array replace recursive, is that you just say these are the real properties that I want to give them. See if I can zoom in maybe. So you see that I say no. I have my type is user, my label is author and not UID. My description is the author of the exercise and not UID property. And then the whole bunch of other elements in this array I'm not going to touch. Then I'm going to use this array replace recursive to kind of put them on top of each other and override the values that I put. Use this little array to override the values that are actually in the info array. This should be 5, by the way. This is for me where the magic really happens, the entity metadata wrapper, which will probably be just taken out of this fly is here attacking me constantly. The entity metadata wrapper will be probably taken out of Drupal 8 as I understand it. If anyone knows it exactly, they can correct me. But what this does, normally when you want to value, what we all have done in the past, I'm sure, let's say I want a referenced ID, identity, a node identity, or anything that I've referenced using my entity reference field, then we would use the entity object, then the field, then UND, undefined language, then 0, then target ID, and then you would have a number, and then you would load the object manually. It's a big hassle. We don't even know if we are in an undefined language. We might be in Spanish or in English. Some people say you shouldn't use the string. You should use the constant, which is language none. But in fact, it's still complicated to use and complicated to read. When you wrap this object into a wrapper, so this is not what we're going to do. We're going to put our object in a wrapper using the entity metadata wrapper, and any value that you need. I don't know if you can read it. Is it readable, or do you have to zoom in? Yeah? You just say wrapper, get me the field and get me the value, and then if there's only one value, it will immediately get you the first value, but it won't even get you the number of the ID. It will get you the entire object, so you don't use a load, and you can chain it. You can get, for example, I created a wrapper for my exercise. I call the user ID for the author. Then I say mail and then value, and I get the email address of the author that created this particular exercise. Much easier. You can also use this wrapper to set values, so you don't have to load. You do have to load the entity, but you don't have to save it afterwards. If you set it, the value is saved and the entity is automatically updated. But you need to, when we looked at metadata properties, there's a whole bunch of types of metadata that you can build for a property. It needs to have a setter callback. That's important. If you don't put that, it will break, it doesn't work. So this is how you build your entity type. Now, I think the best way is to show you how the e-learning module works. And based on what you see, you can ask me questions about how I did it. The e-learning module right now is in a sandbox state. You can definitely not use it for production. I hope to have finished it but I didn't, as usual. But, well, hey, Drupal 8 is having some delays too, so I don't feel too guilty about it. Anyone can check it out. Go into DrupalCamp2013.northweb.com. You can log in and create your exercises courses. 50 minutes left, including questions. All right. So, has to be quicker than I thought, but so what I did with this module is create an extra menu for everything that's related to the e-learning. You can open the questions and the exercises, and you see here that I've built 2 exercises, test exercises. Results are saved. I use views with to show the results. And I used views bulk updates and rules to create actions to be able to delete them manually. For example, exercise result. Well, let's delete the test result, your unit result. And I'm just, well, let's see. So on the first page you see the course, and then you can click through. You might have different units in this course, maybe a list. This is also views. And basically it's a views formatter for the entity A reference field. And when you take the test, you start the exercise result is saved with the status that it's started, it's not finished, it has a timestamp of when it was started. So, time starts running. Is it raining? I don't know, but I'll type in no. Last year's Drupal Madrid. An open question, for example. And here you see the results, the questions, and I can click, for example, on details to have a pop-up, which is a view mode, a feedback view mode. You see your answer, Madrid. But the actual answer was actually Cáceres. So this is basically, obviously, in the real module, it will all look nice and not Bartik, and it will have different. Well, at least our implementation of the module, but what we try to do is get a global functionality for an e-learning module with courses, exercises, units, and questions. Now, I think it's probably best idea just to ask me.
This is a
Contribuido. Sí, sí, cambiamos al español, ¿no? Para las preguntas. Bueno, como queráis. Sí, bueno, el e-learning, la intención es que sea un módulo contribuido. Pero es un sandbox. Sandbox son módulos que están en una fase anterior, que no están para compartir ya, pero ya puedes descargar una versión con Git. Puedes descargar una versión y ver cómo está hecho. No, en este módulo todavía no está implementado, pero a lo mejor. So, he asked if it was possible to work with organic groups. This is not implemented in this module right now. Any questions about how to build an entity? Preguntas sobre cómo hacer la entidad. ¿Quieres el micrófono?
Bueno, primero, gracias por tu charla. Lo segundo, mi pregunta es al respecto, hemos visto cómo es la creación de una entity. Si quieres modificar una entity existente que la provee otro módulo, ¿el procedimiento es el mismo que el de creación o hay que tener algunas cosas más en cuenta? O sea, ¿cuál es la manera efectiva de alterar una entity existente?
Depende, tienes el hook de entity info alter y con eso puedes cambiar los valores de la entidad que ya existe. Sin embargo, si quieres añadir una propiedad, tienes que añadir una tabla en la base de datos, o una columna en la tabla de la base de datos. Eso no sé si conviene hacerlo, lo podrías hacer. Creas en punto .install creas una función para añadir un update para añadir la columna y luego en hook entity info alter añades la propiedad. Eso lo podrías hacer perfectamente, sí.
Pero, ¿es la manera correcta o...?
Sí, es la manera, no hay otra manera de hacerlo, sí.
Vale, gracias.
Más cosillas. Sí, ahí.
Hola. Bueno, mi pregunta viene en cuanto a los bundles, ¿verdad?
Sí.
Porque ¿qué pasa? El módulo Profile y el de Nodo, los bundles son creados vía interfaz.
Sí.
Pero en mi caso, que trataba de resolver, quería hacerlo programáticamente porque ya sabía qué tipos iban a haber, pero no encontré ninguna forma de crearlos de forma programática.
Sí, tu caso es el mío, exactamente igual. En Profile, los bundles son entidades en sí, y hay mucha discusión si tienen que ser entidades en sí, y obviamente ellos te facilitan crear los bundles a través de la interfaz. Yo tampoco lo quería porque yo quiero controlar los submódulos, por ejemplo, las preguntas, las preguntas abiertas y a través de submódulos. Ahora te enseño cómo lo he hecho yo. Si ves, esta es la carpeta aquí a la derecha, no sé si lo veis,
Sí.
del módulo Elearning, y tiene módulos dentro que son las cuatro patas. A ver si va. Ay. Bueno, estamos sin conexión. Sí, los módulos dentro. Perdón. Sí, aquí ves los submódulos que son cada entidad, y por ejemplo en question lo que he hecho es crear un hook. Si vas tiene que arrancar el NetBeans, pero la idea es cuando creas la entidad en el hook entity info, pones un hook. En realidad lo haces en el entity info alter para que el hook funcione ya, porque corre después. Aquí lo vemos, a ver. A ver si... Bueno, no sé si lo podéis leer. Bueno, no sé si lo podéis leer, pero bueno, lo que he hecho es aquí creo un array de bundles y pongo un module invoke all, que es para crear un hook. Así creas un hook. Y que pone question type. Entonces, el hook es hook _ question type. Y yo luego voy al submódulo. Le daba pues la conexión está en el submódulo, por ejemplo, tengo un submódulo de sí. Tengo que cambiar el wifi de la otra. Ah, vale. Bueno, aquí hay los submódulos, por ejemplo, pregunta abierta, y aquí pongo el hook que devuelve un array de todos los bundles que tengo, que es la primera función. El hook question type. Y así creas pues el bundle de tu propia entidad si lo quieres hacer con código y no quieres usar una interfaz.
Gracias.
¿Más preguntas? Sí.
Una cosa que nos sorprendió un poco cuando trabajamos con entidades era la cantidad de código que había que escribir para tener solamente lo que es el esqueleto de una entidad y volver a trabajar, sobre todo si lo comparamos con, por ejemplo, rules o field API, donde es muy fácil crear campos. Aquí parecía como que había que escribir mucho código. Entonces, quería saber si conocías alguna forma de automatizar ese proceso, de generar, pues no sé, a través de algún módulo contribuido o a través de algún comando detrás, alguna forma de generar lo que es el esqueleto de una entidad para empezar a trabajar a partir de ahí. Gracias.
Sí, hay un módulo que te genera los entity types a través de la interfaz y te genera todo. Luego, a la hora de controlar el código y cómo funcione, no sé si es muy fácil. Hay un módulo, pero no te puedo decir cómo se llama. Yo creo que se llama pues algo como entity, bueno, no sé cómo se llama. Ahora te lo busco. Pero es inevitable si lo quieres hacer con código, porque lo más difícil de todo es meter la parte de la administración. La base de datos es un hook y el hook entity info es un hook, es lo único que necesitas. Luego para cambiar la metadata, las propiedades, también es un hook, no lo necesitas por defecto. Bueno, no lo necesitas, pero conviene usarlo. O sea, 3 hooks básicos. Y luego la administración, los formularios, sí que tienes que meterlo. O tienes, por ejemplo, los resultados no tiene formulario, porque lo guardo en código. Depende de lo que quieres hacer.
Sí. Bueno, yo me refería más bien para tenerlo en código. O sea, lo digo porque hay algunos módulos, por ejemplo, hay uno que se llama Module Builder o algo así, y hay otro parecido que es a través de Drush, que te generan un esqueleto de un módulo y tienen soporte para entidades. Entonces no sé si has probado alguna de esas cosas y si merece la pena, si tiene problemas, no sé.
No lo he probado y no conozco ningún módulo que hace lo que tú dices a través de Drush, generar los ficheros. A mí no me parece tanto código, pero sí que es verdad que si quieres sobreescribir un node, es un preprocess node o hook node view, mucho más fácil. Pero claro, que tienes todo lo de node y no tienes tu propia entidad, no tienes tu propio controller. Luego, a la hora de desarrollar una aplicación, yo creo que conviene usar ya tu propia entidad. Pero mi respuesta a tu pregunta es que no lo sé. Luego, sí, no sé si hay una pregunta más, pero si hay tiempo, quería enseñar el tema de las relaciones en views para que veáis 5 minutos, que por defecto ya está todo metido cuando cambias la metadata de tu entidad.
¿Necesitas en views instalarte a algún otro módulo o ya lo trae views integrado?
Sí, no, nada más que views. Y en Drupal 8 views vienen core. Entonces, por ejemplo, en esta tabla, en los resultados, lo que guardo es, por ejemplo, un resultado de una pregunta, lo que guardo es el ejercicio, la unidad, el curso, porque la pregunta siempre está vinculada con todas las 3 capas. el resultado de la pregunta. Entonces vamos a ver, esta tabla es la tabla de resultados de preguntas. Y aquí, por ejemplo, puedo añadir el usuario. A ver. Exercise. Claro, primero añado el resultado del ejercicio. Y bueno, ya lo tenía. Y el usuario del ejercicio. Esto lo puedo borrar porque ya lo tenía. Y entonces, esto puede ir encadenado también. Ahora añado lo que es el nombre del usuario que ha hecho la prueba de nivel o lo que sea, las preguntas del ejercicio. Y la última columna es el nombre del usuario. ¿Y por qué puedo vincularlo? Porque si lo veo en código, esto es una relación del resultado del ejercicio y aquí en Hook Entity Property Info Alter he cambiado lo que es el UID, que es el usuario que ha hecho la prueba, el ejercicio. He cambiado el tipo que estaba como integer, lo he cambiado a user. Y con eso ya está activado la relación en views, pero también en otros sitios. O sea, si cambias esto, las propiedades, si vais a buscar en la documentación lo que puedes hacer con la metadata de las propiedades, verás que hay un montón de cosas. Incluso puedes añadir propiedades que no están en la tabla, que son propiedades calculadas a base de otro contenido o lo que sea.